Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. The Middle East, one of the most tension-filled regions of the world. A lot of the geopolitics flows out that region. A lot of the oil comes from that region. That's one of the reasons that the geopolitics revolves around in the Middle East. There are a lot of players in the game. One of the biggest ones that everybody is talking about today is Iran. Let's understand Iran a little more. Of course, India has very good relations with Iran, and a lot more seems to be happening in that particular region. But to understand Iran more, you need someone who's been there, who's been in the region, who's smelt the air, who's seen the sand of that region. I have someone with me, Major General Jagatbir Singh. Sir, thank you so much for joining me. This is going to be an interesting discussion. A lot many people don't talk about the Middle East that much because I guess it's always in a turmoil. But let's understand this a little more with the central player, which is Iran.
Thank you very much, Adi. And firstly, thank you very much for calling me on your show. It's indeed an honor and privilege for me to be participating with you on Dev Talks. And I've heard a lot of your shows, and I must compliment you for the wonderful manner you literally sum up the issue at hand. So it's an interesting subject, and the way you started off by Middle East. So let's just work on that word Middle East. I wonder how this Middle East term originated. Yeah, that is and if you read Talmiz Ahmad's book on West Asia at War, he says actually this is a British term which has been coined because is this actually the middle of the East? That's something what he said. And he said this was the East as far as the British Empire at that time felt the Ottomans were the East, and anything beyond that was the Middle East. And then you came to China, which was the Far East. So this is where you stuck yourself. Whereas in India, a lot of us refer to this as West Asia.
West Asia.
So I mean, So for us, it's more of West Asia, and for them, and a lot of people say that this term was actually coined by Mahan at some stage or somewhere in the Foreign Affairs Journal. But as you said, Middle East or West Asia, whatever, it's a very interesting and fascinating reason for many things. And one issue you brought out is that, it's today considered one of the wealthiest regions because of the oil. But it's also geostrategically an extremely important region. It was the home of ancient civilization. So we can't just wish that away. If you look at the civilization in the Asian context, apart from the Indus Valley, I think there was the Mesopotamian, the Babylonian, the Persian Empire, the Ottoman. So actually, this is a region where you have all these civilizations actually converging on each other. So you have the Persians, you have the Arabics, and you have the Turks. As far as you have the Ottoman Empire, you have the Arabics. Today you have the Jews over there, you have the Christians over there, you have the Muslims over there. So I mean, these three major, and all of them affect each other in some way or the other. Now, within the Muslim population itself, I mean, we tend to refer to it as just Islamic or Muslim, but even within the Muslim, and that's will come out in the course of our discussion today, there are various sects within the Muslims. So the largest, of course, are the Sunnis, which are the dominant player in this region. So how do they dominate this area? Next, you have the Shias. Shias are the ones who are dominating and ruling Iran. The Zoroastrians were there earlier. Zoroastrians have now reduced to a minority. But finally, when Iran converted, though they retained certain of their original, they retained their language and they retained certain traits of the Zoroastrian civilization and religion. But the dominant, what they converted to in the 15th century was the Shia stream of the Islam. And then you have smaller players who are also influenced in this area and who people try to, influence. So you have the Alawites in Syria, which is a offshoot of the Shias, and which is a small group which is being headed by President Assad, and then you have Christians, you have the Jews in Israel. You talked about Israel is also there. And then you have the Druze and the Maronites. Now, the Druze is the offshoot of the Shia Muslims, and the Maronites are offshoot of Roman Catholics. A famous Maronite who we all would have read about, I read his books was Khalil Gibran. And in all this, they all have, the names are very common. So they're not fixed names one way or the other. Like I happen to be, like you said, I happen to be posted in Iraq during the time of Saddam. And actually, Saddam was a Sunni ruler ruling over a majority Shia state. And who were the people he chose to be his confidants? Were the Christians. And who were the Christian, most famous Christian? Was his prime minister called Tariq Aziz, who's actually a Christian. So very few people know about this. And then you have the region which is just little north of Iran, Iraq, and going into Turkey, which is the Kurdistan. And then you have people like the Yazidis. And down south, as I told you, you have Saudi Arabia, which is purely, mainly Sunni, with a small Shia minority. And then you have Yemen, where there's again a clash between the Shias and the Sunnis, because what we call the Al-Houthi tribe, who control the Yazidis, who are again a Shia majority people who are wanting to retain control. So what I wanted to say was there's interplay of various regional influences in this region, be it of the ethnicities of people, be it of the type, be it Arabic or be it Turkish or be it the Israelis with other Jews. And prior to, please excuse me, prior to World War One, this area was controlled mainly by the British and the French. Now the British wanted to control the Persian Gulf. So after World War One, this area was divided, literally divided. Borders were redrawn, new countries came about, changes took place. And you had two very prominent agreements. One was the Sykes-Picot Agreement between the French and the British. Then you had the Mandate System. Then you had the Balfour Declaration. Basically, all it meant was that this was, the whole area was the Ottoman Empire, one side, and the other side was Persia on modern day Iran. And this area of the Greater Arabia was broken up into various countries, and that formed modern day Iraq, modern day Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was always existing. I'll come to that. They were a key player at that time also, because they controlled two of the holiest shrines, Mecca and Medina, which are the most important shrines as far as Islam is concerned, be it Shia or be it Sunni. The most important Shia shrines happen to be in Iraq, which are Karbala and Najaf. So, I mean, these are very, very strong religious ties which no one can wish away. So, everybody who's a Muslim has ties to Mecca and Medina, because that's where the Prophet originated from, that area. So, these are things you have to know. So what the British did at that time, they created local rulers who were almost puppets in their hands. And some of them have survived as monarchies today, and some of them are the republicans. So countries took their various ways. In the meantime, you had an issue regarding Arab nationalism, which came up, and the Arabic word for it is Baath, and you had the Baath Party. So the Baath Party started ruling Iraq, and the Baath Party, the Baathists, as they are called, are still in control of Syria. Now, one interesting fact, which I mean, everybody knows it, but I'd just like to highlight it because most viewers may not be aware, is that the area of modern day Saudi Arabia was controlled by two families, so to say. One was the Sharif family and one was the Al Saud family. And yeah, both of them, the Sharif family was more in Western Saudi Arabia, the Al Saud family was more in Eastern Saudi Arabia. And both of them were, trying and vying for the control of the Ottomans tried to, get them on their side. The British tried to get them on their side. The British wanted their help during World War One. During World War II, Saudi Arabia and all this area generally remained, out of the conflict, almost semi-neutral. So finally, when the struggle took place for after World War One, the Sauds, they had been earlier, this area had earlier been under the Egyptians for a while. Then the Sauds the family went to Kuwait, then they came back, captured Riyadh in 1902 as as late as that or as early as that, whatever way you like to look at it. And then they have this issue with the Sharif family, which is the Sharif family controlled Mecca and Medina, but finally the South family prevailed, or maybe the British
Okay.
wanted the Sharifs out, and the Sharifs were given, two countries. So the sons of uh, Sharif were given the kingdom of Jordan belongs to that lineage, and that's why they call it the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. But the person who went to Syria never survived very long over there because of the problems with the mandate, whether Syria should remain in the British mandate or Syria should go outside the British mandate. And uh, this was Sharif Hussein's son. Sharif Hussein, of course, passed away in 1924, and his two sons were Faisal and Abdullah. So finally, this son, one of them went to Syria. He was made the king of Syria, but he barely lasted a few months, and then finally he came and he took over the kingdom of Iraq. So he was the monarchy originally from Saudi Arabia who headed Iraq. And when Sharif, was fighting this battle against the Ottomans, the British never had any troops. He also never had any troops. So he relied on the Bedouins, which are the guys who live in the desert, the camels, and they're basically tough people who stay off the desert. And one very famous Britisher who assisted him and then gained great fame in movies was Lawrence of Arabia. So everybody would have heard of that. Yeah. So Faisal, when he took over Syria, was in 1918, and he was very nationalistic and very secular. But along with him, he had an education minister, a guy called Al Husri. So Al Husri, then when this guy went to Baghdad, Al Husri went to Baghdad with him. And Al Husri is the brain behind this Arab identity. And as I talked to you about this Arab nationalism, and the Saudis had another thing that when they were Al Saud was in control, there was a very famous Muslim preacher. You can call him that. You can call him something else. So basically, he was in. This is in early 1700. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab, and so today you have the Wahhabi. So basically, it was Wahhabism. So basically, he was very. He said that religious matters will be controlled by us, and you handle all the political and the military issues. So, I mean, this is the essence of this whole thing. Now, as far as the land goes, the most important waterways are the waterways that come is the Euphrates and the Tigris River. Rest of it was desert area. Finally, what changed the whole thing was in 1908 when oil was discovered for the first time. And oil was discovered for the first time in a place in Iran called Masjid-e-Suleiman. Very few people would have known about it. This is bordering Iraq now. And this was discovered in a place where an original fire temple used to be, and that fire of the temple never went off, possibly because the oil must have seeped through from underneath and kept that fire going. So, I mean, of course, then after that is the American and the British today are all wanting to control the oil. So, as I said, the external players earlier were the British and the French. But today, the external players have changed. The external players are the US, the Chinese, and the Russians. So, these are the three major players in the region. You can see Russia asserting itself in Syria. The Chinese have made inroads everywhere. You say there are sanctions against Iran, but China still buys Iranian oil. When I was there in Iraq, one of the few embassies which had great control over Saddam and, not control over Saddam, but were in touch with Saddam was the Chinese ambassador there. I mean, they were there in a large presence. Of course, that time our Indian ambassador was also there because India and Iraq had very, very close relations, like India and Iran also has close relations. So these are things that we must, understand, and this just gives us a little background of this whole thing. So today, this region is full of oil. It wanted for water. That was the thing. It has great civilization, but there always been a clash. And in 1979 was the turning point, so to say, as far as this region and as far as the world goes. Because three things happened in 1979 which have had a telling effect right till today. And they even affected, I mean, they've affected us also in many ways, India in many ways. And the first thing was the revolution in Iran, the Islamists coming to power, deposing the Shah. So when I cover Iran, Iraq, I'll talk about that in greater detail. But that was one thing. The second thing was the taking over, and when the Iranian revolution came up, they felt that, now they are the ones who represent all the Muslim interests. So they must be the ones who are looked up upon. The second thing, what happened later that year was the taking over of the mosque, holy mosque in Saudi Arabia by a group from outside. And they tried to say that, this has affected the way the Saudis are no longer custodians of the holy sites. So it was a dent on there and it's had a huge impact on them. And the third thing that happened was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And then you saw these commencement of the jihadis culture, which then spilled over into Kashmir. And at this time, they decided, I mean, the Saudis and a lot of people decided that now, because of this problem, is now where we have to counter this, we must use religion at the forefront of our conflicts. Yeah. So you started seeing greater push towards, using of religion at the forefront to resolve these issues. So I mean, that's how it is. So I just thought, before we start, I'll just give you a brief overview of this region, how it is, how it shaped up, and where we are today. Today, of course, they're all modern states. Today, are you more closer because of religious reasons? Are you more nationalistic because you belong to your own country? Everybody is looking at their own interests in this region. And as I said, energy and oil has a major role to play. Yeah. I hope that sums it up there.
Energy, indeed. So I think the world is today kind of looking out for itself with regards to energy. But let's kind of step back into history a little bit. So, Iran, of course, had the Shah that was reinstated by the Americans. I think he stayed there for about 20 years and then he got deposed. 1979, as you say, was a turning point, as a matter of fact, between the entire, I would say, stability in the region, because the Americans went off against Iran and then the whole thing happened off. But my question to you is about Iran and Iraq, which dominated the use for more than 20-25 years. They fought wars, they fought proxy wars, and today we see an Iraq which is dominated by Iran. How has this game been played since uh, post the Second World War, and how has things landed up to where they are today, sir?
Well, as I talked to you, Iran and Iraq have had deep historical ties, deep historical relations, but they've not always been on the same pattern. There have been a lot of ups and downs, like you very clearly, and it doesn't stretch back just to the beginning of the World War II, the end of the World War II. It's actually going back millennia.
Yeah.
So if you go back, who was in control, when they were in control, what was the Persian Empire, what was the Ottoman Empire, what was the Abbasid Empire, what was the Babylonian civilization, how it went, how it changed. So Iraq actually feels that it is, I mean, this is the feeling I got when I was there. Actually, it is between all the dominant powers. It is actually being squeezed by all the dominant powers. They feel their geographical location is such that one side they have Turkey, the south they have Saudi Arabia, and to the east they have Iran. You see, so all these three have had major issues with Iraq over the years. And to the north, they have the Kurds region. So, I mean, they felt that. And so, as I talked to you, there have been several things. And Iraq, surprisingly, is a Shia majority state. But there are pockets of Sunnis. And what happened was that Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. So, as I mentioned earlier, so he had that different control over Iraq than what you're seeing it today. Iran and Iraq had an 8 years war. The war, no one knows what is the actual background of the war. But if you look back into history, again, like you're saying, when the British left the Gulf, they wanted to divide the area of the Gulf between, who's going to be the dominant player there? Will it be Saudi? Will it be Persia? And at that time, the Shah of Iran was extremely close to the British, because the Iran was the first country where they had, put in a constitution in place in the Middle East. And the Shah was actually Reza Pahlavi. He was from the Cossack. He was a Cossack colonel who had taken over. And then they had a very famous prime minister called, maybe I'll get the pronunciation wrong, Muttaqid or something, and he was deposed by the Americans in 1953. And then the Shah was put on the throne, and the Shah was extremely pro the US. So a lot of changes happened in US during that time. And at this time, what was happening in Iraq? Iraq was going to the Ba'athist party. Then Iraq came under, the Ba'athist regime, and finally they came under Saddam Hussein. And in 79, in 75, there was a thing known as the Algiers Accord, which is dividing the waters of the Shatab al-Arabi, the water between the two countries going into the Persian Gulf. And at that time, Algeria was a major player in the Arab world. So Algeria had brokered this peace accord.
Oh.
But the Iraqis always felt that they had got the wrong end of the deal. And at that time, there's some writing also that goes on that the Iraqis also felt that the Iranians, along with the Americans and the Israelis, were fomenting trouble in Kurdistan for them. And they were fomenting trouble in Kurdistan to keep Saddam's focus to the north and not let him concentrate on the south, where the wealth of Iraq lies in the south. So that was also something that is there. So this issue did take place, and this is how it was. And they fought an 8 years war. It was a terrible war. There was no winner. There was no victor. There was no loser. Minor gains were made, but it scarred a complete generation. Now, I have lived in Iraq for a year, nearly 6 months. I was physically there in Baghdad, and I could see, there were large monuments in memory of the war. They had hyped it up to say as if they had won the war. People were scared. Every family, young men were, literally sent to the borders. A lot of them were injured. There was poor medical facilities. There were, battle scarred psychologically and physically wounded men roaming around in Iraq and who had to be looked after. And this was a terrible, terrible, terrible loss economically for the Iraqis and the Iranians. And when this war took place, whose side did who take? You should be very clear on that. The Iraqis were more supported by the Soviet equipment at that time. The Iranians were supported initially by the American. They had American equipment because of the time of Shah of Iran, but this happened during the Khomeini time. But the Iraqis were supported entirely by the Saudis. So the Saudi shift was to Iraq, and that also caused a huge rift. So was it a war between, it was a war between two major states, Iraq and Iran, but it was a Sunni-controlled Iraq versus a Shia-controlled Iran. And a lot of the Iranians, the Shias in Iraq were prosecuted, and some of them went into exile in Iran, including the father of Al-Sadr, who was killed. So, these are all things there. The Kuwait invasion was the reverse of that. Now, here is a country which, supports the GCC and Saudi supported Iraq, and yet Saddam went and invaded Kuwait, and he got anti these people. And at this time, Iran took the side of Saudi. So literally Iraq was isolated, and this period became the isolation of Iraq, and Iraq was totally isolated. They were under terrible sanctions. People were selling their goods on the street to survive. There were no jobs. The officers we were dealing with in the army at that stage were almost two timing. Means they'd work in uniform in the day, but in the evening they'd be driving their own vehicles as taxis. I
Wow.
mean, that was the level. I have met officers who were educated in Sandhurst and they were struggling to make two ends meet. And I mean, it's something, the dinar had lost all value
Yeah.
whatsoever.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable. Like you could, dinar, Iraqi dinar was a very strong currency, but it had lost all value. So it was almost touching 3,000 dinar to a dollar. That time a dollar was about 45 rupees. So you can imagine what the rupee and 100 fills make a dinar, and you could get petrol for about 4 fills a liter. So if you top up your car, you pay less than 100 fills, less than a dollar. I mean, less than a dinar, which a dinar is. I mean, it's unimaginable to even count how much pesa. I mean, our tip to the guy used to be more than the cost of the fuel. You know, so they had abundance of fuel, they had abundance of water, but they were under terrible sanctions. So all that was infrastructure that had been built was deteriorating. Yet the Iraqi culture was something different. They were more westernized in their approach.
Yeah.
They were totally there, and they had this huge secularism. They had Christians, they had Muslims, and they had the Yazdi. They were all living together. So there was no problem whatsoever, and they were highly educated, spoke in English. They were allowed alcohol, unlike Kuwait and Saudi. So, I mean, these are the changes that were there. So, this was the lowest as far as the Iraq-Iran relations. And today you're seeing is the high point of the Iraq-Iran relations. So now what happened? After the Gulf War, the Saudis and here he's attacked, Saddam Hussein has attacked Saudi. Saudi is dead against it. When the Americans get together to overthrow Saddam, you would feel that the first lot of people who come into Iraq to help Iraq rebuild themselves should have been the Saudis and the GCC countries, whereas the total opposite happened. So you have US entering Iraq, overthrowing Saddam. Their staunchest allies in the region are the Saudis and the GCC countries. And the country which is actually reached out to Iraq to help them rebuild has been Iran. Now, why did this happen? So that's where the key lies. And why it happened was that the main reason, as I told you, is the majority of the population of Iran was the Shia of Iraq was Shias, and bulk of the leadership of the Shias had been sheltering in Iran during the problem with Saddam. So these guys came back. They filled the political vacuum, and Iran, though it was under sanctions at that time, which we'll cover when we talk about JCPOA and all, it still started helping them. So they were strong. They had the longest border with them. 1,400 kilometers is the Iran-Iraq border. You have strong religious ties, as I told you, Najaf and Karbala are there. And you have this, the trade between the two were the highest. Now, when Iraq was under sanctions, Iraq's maximum trade and maximum movement was through Jordan, through Turkey. But now, after 2003, Jordan, Turkey, Iran, these became the key players. And just for example, an Iraqi can go into Iran without a visa today. He doesn't require a visa. He doesn't have to apply for it.
Imagine, sir.
So, so that's how much the change has taken place. And, the next issue is that while they have, developed these ties, they've also, helped with the infrastructure. So today, the biggest import of Iran to Iraq is gas. And what is that gas used for? Electricity. Now, Iraq doesn't have a good electricity generation system. So the bulk of the electricity comes from Iran. Now, the Saudis and all are telling them, you take the electricity from us. So they are saying, fine, we'll take the electricity from you. But they have taken so long, 5 years to, develop the lines between GCC countries and Iraq. So no guy is going to live, for 5 years without electricity in this blistering heat with sandstorms in that area. So, I mean, these are the problems which are there. So this is another reason. The next issue which is there is that when Iraq started having problems within Iraq post the American coming in, it was the ISIS who was raising its head, and there was severe problems within Iraq. And who came to help in eliminating the ISIS? Ironically, it was the Iranians. And it was the Iranian groups. And one of the key players in this whole game for Iraq is the IRGC, the Islamic Revolution Guards. And so they have an army and they have these IRGCs. And the IRGC guys are also protecting the borders and also spreading their philosophy and spreading their thing. So I don't think Iran today is ready for another Saddam. But the fear in Iraq is Iran developing a strong Shia bloc within them. So now what you're seeing is fissures within the Shia bloc. So Al-Sadr is not, all pro-Iran like he was earlier. Today, they have not been able to form a government. Why? Because everybody is not agreeing on the number of people who should form a government. Today, the party which, fought for them, the PMU is also almost broken up. So there are problems within Iraq, but the maximalist goal as far as Iran is concerned is a united Shia bloc. But today, what I wanted to say is that they have this goal within them to have a maximalist Shia bloc. So will it be a puppet, or would a country like to control its own destiny? So this is where the first issue takes place. The second issue which is taking place is that large number of the youth within Iraq feel that what is more important to us today is not religion. More important to us is good governance and jobs.
That's what we see happening, yes.
Yeah, so if you can't provide good governance and good jobs, then you start blaming the government. And which is the government they're blaming? They're not blaming Saddam because he's gone. So they're blaming the Shia governments that have been in place post Saddam, and as a result, they're blaming Iran for a lot of their problems. So this is a huge challenge that the Iranians are facing. You have in every society you have two types. You see of people. You have those people who are very radical in their views, the conservatives. So I mean, those are firmly in their pocket of the Iranians. But they have to start appealing to the non-religious, secular Shiites.
Normal section.
Yeah, the normal section of people. The normal section of people say, yes, you have helped us with electricity, you helped us with trade, you opened up the borders for us, you are natural allies, Karbala and Najaf are there, but you've helped defeat Iran, helped defeat ISIS, you've let us there. But, you must also help us in other things, and that is to improve our lot in the world. So America has to do that. And as I said, so all these players around have to do that. Iraq should not be seen as a battleground between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the US, the conflicting interests of these three players. The locals don't want to see it like that. So I think this is what I had to say about Iran and Iraq. So today, as I said, there was a perception always that Iran is a regional hegemon in this region. But is it still there? Do they need? Iraq does need Iran for dependence on oil, dependence on gas and electricity. It does need foreign capital to help improve its infrastructure. And they feel that the Saudis and the GCC never embraced them post 2003. And ultimately, every country needs to develop its own domestic capability. So
correct.
That's the way forward. What we are also talking of today, Atmanirbhar. But so far, this is it. And so far, the relations are very close. And I don't see them having the major disruptions that they had earlier, given this sort of background and given this sort of thing. So this is, you know,
Thank you, sir, for
uh,
that. That's an interesting. I think I must compliment the storytelling because it's taken us through history. It's important for us to understand that because I guess and I'd like to state this for the viewers that this is not just a simple discussion. This is going to be a series of discussions where we will actually dwell into the Middle East or the West Asia, as we call it in India, where we'll try and understand what are the politics and how the region actually functions. Because if nothing else, India has a lot of interest in that region, and if we need to create a separate transport corridor, as has been spoken about, the north-south corridor. We also see India putting a lot of effort in Afghanistan. All this will combine together with a good relation and a good setup within the West Asia. That was as I said, the next thing that I'd like to talk to you about are the two biggest, if I may, put it that way, and with no offense to either one, the biggest rivals in this particular region is the Iranians and Saudis. And recently it was a surprising news to actually read that the Iranians and Saudis are actually trying to open up diplomatic dialogue between both of them, and these are century old rivalries that have been going on. Of course, it's difficult for for us to go through the centuries worth of history, but let's talk about the modern era. How do you think both these states were with the previous Iranian regime in place, and what changed after 1979, and how have they come to a point today where they're trying to brush off their past and probably move forward?
yeah, you're right about their brushing of their past moving forward, because today one of the latest news items doing the round is that Iran is willing to allow the Kuwaitis and the some other GCC country to open diplomatic relations,
Diplomatic, yes.
and yeah, and they are at a far advanced stage of talks, and the talks, by the way, are being brokered through Iraq, and they're going to have a political level meeting between the foreign minister of Iran and Saudi Arabia in Baghdad, most probably soon. So
Wow.
I mean, so that's how fast things. So very rightly you said, you brought me down to the modern era, so to say. So I'll just start with that. Saudi was established in 1932. Iran, modern day Iran, in 1925. Today, Saudi is a 805 billion economy with a huge per capita income of $22,000, whereas Iran is a 683 billion economy with a per capita income of $8,000. So both were firmly part of the Western Bloc. Both are major oil and gas exporters. So if you look at it, both were monarchies. So where has the difference occurred? Why has it gone where we are today? So today, there have been no diplomatic relations between Saudi and Iran since January 2016. You must be aware of that. And that is after about 47 Shias, including the cleric Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, was executed in Saudi Arabia, because, as I told you, Saudi also has a huge population of, excuse me, Saudi also has a population of
Cheers.
Shias. They're not that big, but
It's there.
they're I mean, they're sizable, and Saudi feel that these guys are interfering in their internal affairs. So, I mean, this guy was Syrian war today. Both countries are on the opposite side of the spectrum. Iran supports Assad. Saudi supports the rebels. Iran-Iraq war, I already told you, the Saudi supported Saddam at that stage. Gulf war, Iran supported Gulf. So, till 79, both were on the same side. They were pro-British, pro-US. But after 79, the Iranians feel that Saudi Arabia is an agent of the United States. That is their categoric thing. And they feel, they control the two holy shrines, Mecca and Medina. And Khomeini is opposed to monarchy. And post this Arab Spring, the monarchists in the Arab world are, holding on to their thing.
Yeah.
They have all become anti what they call the Muslim Brotherhood, which started in Egypt. And the Saudis feel that the Shias are discriminated. Now, this history, it just suddenly 2016 doesn't happen just like that, killing of Al Nimr el Nimr. As I said, in this region, there are old ties, but the patterns keep changing, the things keep changing. 1943 was the first such execution which took place. And that guy's name was Abu Talib Yazdi. And he was an Iranian pilgrim was executed for vomiting on the Kaaba. That's what they had said. In 1940, yeah, 1946, the ties restarted, but they were, not that great. 1966 was a sort of breakthrough when the King Faisal that time visited Tehran and the Shah visited Iran, visited Riyadh. But, then I told you about when the British vacated, this Gulf region had to be kept in, who was responsible. So both these countries decided. And there's an agreement in 68 called the Demarcation Agreement, where both countries, take, issues on ensuring the stability and security of this region, basically to allow the oil to flow. But, in spite of the countries both being monarchists, I'll just give a small incident. So the Shah wrote to the King of Saudi Arabia, I think this sometime in the late 60s, and he told him in words to the effect that, you need to modernize, you need to open up your country, you should allow your women to be in miniskirts and you should allow discourse. I mean, this is the type of language he used. So guess what? The King of Saudi Arabia replied back to the Shah. He said, oh, basically hinting that, he said, you're the Shah of Iran, not the Shah of France. Remember, your control, you're Shah of Islamic people, 90% of your population is Muslim. So, you ultimately, who won and who lost. The Shah of Iran is no longer there. The modernization has not taken place. In fact, the opposite has happened in Iran and slowly opening up. But Saudi started getting worried about Iran when Iran started modernizing its military and started bearing its military might in the 70s, because they felt that this is now the country that is going to challenge them. And at that time, I told you, it was a major issue between the two countries, who's going to be the dominant power, but both were being supported by the West. 79, we've already talked about. I wouldn't like to repeat that, So every time they've been on different sides of the pole. 87, there was again a major incident in I think it was in Mecca. There were about riots. There were about 400 people dead, out of which 2/3 were Iranian pilgrims. They say about 275. And what given to understand is these were the guys who were wanting to complain or protest against Israel. So, I mean, as a result of that, the Saudi embassy was surrounded. One Saudi was killed. Saudi Arabia cut off diplomatic ties. This is in 1988 also. Then after, the data ties improved, even like a small issue like Salman Rushdie. So both sides have, differing perceptions. What is the Iranian thing was death threat. What is the Saudi thing is he has to appear before a tribunal to answer for why, and then only we will decide what has to be done. So, Gulf War, I told you, Iran supports it. And at the time of the Gulf War, what was very interesting is that Iran tells Saudi that, the GCC is weak. So, yeah, GCC is weak, and that's why Iraq has been able to invade it. So you make us part of the GCC, and we will ensure that no such invasion takes place. Of course, that never happened. Iran, lately, what has been seen here after these incidents, they are actually on two opposite sides of everything. Because the first thing is that which are the rebel groups which are being supported by Iran, which are the rebel groups being supported by Saudi. the major rebel groups which are being supported by Iran, if you start, are firstly the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Then is the Hamas in Israel.
Israel,
Then is the,
Syria, Israel.
in Israel, the Hamas. Then is the, the Houthis in Yemen. Then they're supporting rebel groups in Bahrain. So everywhere they have, and they have the Islamic Jihad also being supported by them. Whereas the Saudis are supporting the groups opposed. So Iran supports Assad, Saudis support somebody, the rebels against Assad. So you have the ISIS being supported in Iraq, in Syria by the West, and ISIS being, against the Iraqi government, and the US is against the ISIS in Iraq. And so what do? They raise armies within Iraq, like the Al Mahdis, give power to Sadr, to Al Sadr.
The
They
Sadr
give,
group, yeah.
and they give power to, tell Soleimani to come in with his forces and start doing that. So in fact, in 2020, when General Soleimani was killed, they said that was a time also when rapprochement was being talked about. And the Iraqis were to start talking to get Iran and Saudi close together. And that is the leak that took place. That's Iran, one of the Iranian schools of thought. And that's how the Americans got to know that he was landing at which time, in which vehicle, how he was coming, and they were targeted him. Now, so whether they targeted him based on Iraqi information or whether Saudi had a role in it, no one knows. Then there have been attacks by Iranian missiles fired by Houthi rebels onto oil installations in Saudi Arabia.
Saudi, UAE.
Yeah. There have been attacks on fishermen. There have been attacks on, naval vessels. So these are all there. The issue between them is very true. Who is the controller of the Islamic world? Is it Saudi or is it Iran? Basically, this is the bottom line. And they will keep burying their differences from time to time for their development, for this thing. But this major issue, I feel, will always remain at the bottom line of the Iraq-Saudi relations. Right now, it is the economy that they need. They need trade. They need, to be part of the global environment, global matrix. So now they're talking of regional dialogue and all that. President Raisi is developing economic ties with neighboring states. But one of the finest remarks on this whole issue has been by President Obama. And I say what he quoted, I've been quoting him. He said, Iran and Saudi Arabia must affect the fact that they cannot eliminate each other's influence and they must learn to work together. So right now, the mediation, as I told you, is being done through Iran. And if this mediation works, I think it's a win-win situation for everybody because you'll see greater stability in this region and greater stability as far as, it will boost the economy of the region, it will boost the development of the region, it will boost everything of the region, it will make a huge difference for, things will move. You're seeing, one of the things you're seeing is closer ties between Israel and UAE, closer ties between Israel and Bahrain. The closer ties are developing between Israel and Morocco, closer ties between Israel
Abraham
and
Accords, yes.
Sudan, and that's the Abraham's Accord, and whether Saudi comes into this. But the major difference, if you say a red line as far as both Iran and Iraq is concerned, remains Palestine. They are firmly behind the Palestinians. So I don't know whether they'll be able to accept Israel as it is, as being part of this whole thing. And both Israel and the Iranians, keep throwing allegations against each other, keep threatening each other, keep saying you will wipe you off from the face of this earth. Both saying we have a responsibility to ensure better world. I mean, without the other hinting at that. So this is the problem. But I mean, this is something that is going to be there. And Saudi relationship with Iran, I think it's right now looking up. So if this actually materializes, it will be good for the region, because then with Saudi and Iran together, they'll be able to even build up Iraq. And if all these three countries combine, the sanctions on oil against Iran will go, and the overall price of oil will decrease in the world, which will benefit us in a great deal. So this is what
Absolutely. I
I
think
have to say.
there was a news yesterday where the Saudi was saying that they will talk to OPEC Plus and try and see if they could reduce their oil productions to introduce Iranian oil
Yeah.
within
So
the demand circle.
there has been a lot of smuggling of Iranian oil,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it's
yeah.
been
The Pakistanis do it quite a
changing.
bit, sir.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm, mm.
So this is as far as Iran and Saudi go. So I hope I've been able to, cover certain points of yours regarding this.
Yes, sir.
I've not
My
talked of the axis of resistance, of how it's developed, how that I think we can keep for some other day,
yeah,
and
yeah,
how
yeah.
you know, uh, Ira- uh, the Iranians feel now that Iraq is in their pocket. They've opened up their channel, which was existing earlier, which had been broken with Syria and Lebanon. So this route, which had been blocked, is now being opened up.
Yes, sir.
That's what they
It's
call it.
interesting. I
Yeah.
mean, that's one of the most interesting thing that there are two countries who fought. I think one of the longest wars
Long
in
8 years, 8 years.
yeah recent
And it's
recent
leave the current generation, because it's a
yeah
generation who
yeah.
was in their 20s and the 80s. So they are in their 60s now. So
And
they
this
are
war,
influential. Yeah, they're influential. And yet they've changed their thing. Just shows what, deep religious ties can do.
yeah. So apart from that war, what happened in Iraq after that in terms of US invasion and then the whole rise of ISIS and stuff like that has kept this region in a turmoil. So,
Yeah.
the last thing I want to talk to you about today concerning Iran is something that we hear right now. It's on. It's called the JCPOA. I think uh, right now it seems like the switch is on and the lights are green, but they turn orange and they turn red, and then it just hovers between the entire game. There are two aspects. Of course, everybody knows that Iran nuclear deal. It's well known, but what is stopping this from going forward, and how does Iran deal with Israel?
Eh, eh, Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. This is indeed extremely important for everybody in the world. This JCPOA. It's going to have huge, huge ramifications. But I'll just dwell on it a little bit so that you get a little sense of, how this has come about, where it has come about. So, as I told you, at one stage, Iran was firmly allied with the West. So, 1953 was the time, and that time the president of America, Dwight Eisenhower, made a statement where he talked about atoms for peace. And he started saying that, certain countries need nuclear energy to develop for peaceful purposes, civilian peaceful purposes. So, you're well aware of the nuclear game. There's the P5, which are the countries which have nuclear, and there are the others which don't have. So now, which were these countries which got American benefit for assistance as far as developing nuclear technology for civil nuclear purposes was concerned, and what sort of benefits came and why did they want it? So interestingly, the four countries which benefited were India, Pakistan, Iran, and Israel. So these were the four countries. I'm sure everybody knows about this. And a lot of our scientists were trained in MIT at that time. So this started in 1950s, 53. And as far as India is concerned, 62, we had the war with China. And 64, at that time, the US had sent a battle carrier into the Bay of Bengal, and the Chinese felt that was a nuclear battle carrier. Plus, there's a story of, the Indian pilot who had gone and carried out extensive recce's and had got to know about uh, the development of the Chinese nuclear energy. Plus, if you read Iqbal Malhotra's book, on the divide between the partition and Kashmir, he talks about the nexus of nuclear energy between China and Russia, and why they wanted Kashmir in their side, because they were monitoring those areas. Anyway, that's a side. So in 1967, uh, Iran got its first civil nuclear, 5 megawatt civil nuclear reactor, and that was set up in what they call the Tehran University. And America also provided the uranium for this. And for uh, uranium for nuclear is actually from U-235, which is in smaller quantities than U-238, because there's more neutrons, less neutrons in 235, 143 versus 146. So if you go to the history, 1945, US did their nuclear explosion, 1949 Russia, 1952 UK, 1960 France, and 64, I told you, was China. As far as we are concerned, 64, and then they did another test in 67, and we did our test in 1974. So, but the P5 always has maintained one single stance. And that's a very strange stance, which is there, that we are the 5 countries which are allowed to have nuclear weapons. We are allowed to grow our arsenal, and we are responsible. Whereas any other country that enters this game is careless, irresponsible, and it is our duty to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. So, this is the bottom line that goes, and you're well aware of our nuclear deal, how it has transformed. So, this is where we were as far as, the nuclear deal goes and nuclear thing goes. Now you cut. So it's all there with the assistance. Now you cut to 1979. Again, that, year that pinches everybody, troubles everybody, changes the world, so to say. So 1979, Iranian Revolution took place, and so now the whole matrix changed. So surprisingly, that time, soon after this Pakistan, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan took place, the first chap who started giving Iran nuclear technology, centrifuge technology, all this, which is now being reported, was none other than A.Q. Khan from Pakistan. Now, where A.Q. Khan got his training, he was in UNICO, he was in Europe, whether he was given those, whether he stole those designs, whether he bought those designs. But there are 3 countries which owe their, nuclear development to A.Q. Khan. One is Iran, one is North Korea, and one is Libya. So you see the double standards as far as US goes. Here's a firm ally, their guy is doing this, and they're dead against nuclear, proliferation, and yet they almost turned a blind eye. Let it happen, let it happen. Whether it was deliberate, whether it was known, how it went, and the one country that remained away from this whole game and remained, I'll say there's great deal of, whether it's deliberate or not deliberate, great deal of ambiguity about their nuclear program, is Israel. So everybody says it's a non-declared nuclear power. But, they have neither denied it, nor have they accepted it. So ambiguity is the game as far as. Now in 84, the first lot of sanctions were put on Iran by the West, and that was against terrorism. So Iran today says it doesn't matter what the sanctions are for. Sanctions are sanctions. So the first lot was in 84. I talked about this 1987 incident, and 1998, A.Q. Khan gave this in 1998. In 87, Iraq started this centrifuge design and all that from A.Q. Khan. 1998, he also said that they've got enough bomb-grade uranium.
Okay.
At that time, there was a group called the Mujahid al-Khalaq, MEK. Now, they are against the ruling political party. Now, whether they are West-sponsored or not, nobody knows. But they are the guys who said that there's a secret nuclear program going on in Iran, and the world must know about it, and you must bring a stop to that. And they gave 2 sites, Natanz and Arak, which are the places where this nuclear thing was going. So the world got activated, and in 2003, they said that Iran must stop enriching nuclear and energy, and they must allow their inspection of their facilities. And in 2009, a secret lab was discovered in a place called Fordo, where they said their capacity for processing of is too high, and they've got 3,000 centrifuges, which is only required for nuclear weapons, and this is it. And that's they launched their first, satellite, and also they launched one satellite from through Iran, from this, Russia at that time. And their latest satellite, of course, military satellite first, was launched in 2020 in the Iranian desert. So, I mean, this is where it was. So, the West decided on a two-track policy to counter this. And the two-track was, first you have diplomatic talks, and at the same time US sanctions. So, when the diplomatic talks were going on, just to ease the pressure and start off, so the West made certain demands on Iran, and amongst the demand, they say, was freeing of certain hostages which were held hostage by the Hezbollah. So the Iranians talked to Nasrallah, and those hostages were released. And to cut a long story short, in July 2015, 14 July 2015, this deal was signed called JCPOA, which is actually the Iran nuclear deal, but it's also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action.
Plan of action.
So that is plan of action. And it was the interim agreement was done in 2013. Negotiations took 20 months. Framework was agreed in April 2015. Finally signed in July 2015, and Obama was the man pushing it at that time. It was high on his agenda, very visible with all his rhetoric and all that. And it was signed at Vienna. P5 plus 1 means Germany, and basically they said that Iran must dismantle some programs. They will be given sanction relief. But at the same time, in October 2015, Iran fired a missile, MR missile, 1,700 kilometers range, a medium range missile. So just see, yeah. So this thing was going, the sanctions were in place, everything. But what happened in May 2018, Trump took office. So Trump had his own, issues on it. And in spite of, in May 2019, IAEA confirming that Iran is abiding by the treaty, and then, Iran then started with impunity, saying it's breached certain limits. And then after the killing of Soleimani, it says we're going ahead with our nuclear program. Basically, Iran feels that it is using nuclear as a leverage to get its sanctions off its back. It feels that use the nuclear tool as a leverage to do that. So one side they use state-sponsored terrorism as a matter of state public policy. At the other side, they're using nuclear, the threat of becoming a nuclear power as a thing to leverage. So they feel the world wants them not to go nuclear, so they'll give in to their concerns. This is my opinion. I may be wrong, or maybe
they've taken a page from the Pakistani playbook. I must say so.
Yeah. Or whether they, So what does the JCPOA say? Eliminate stockpile and cut the stockpile of medium enriched stockpile enriched uranium. You should eliminate. Low enriched uranium, cut it by 98%, and enriched uranium only up to 3.67%. Oh, this was what was laid down over there. So, and enrichment was limited to a single facility, and you can only use first generation centrifuge. And the next thing is the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Authority, has access to facilities. So as a result of this, Iran got relief from sanctions, and they had about $100 billion assets frozen all over the world. That was the move. But when the Soleimani's death took place, Trump withdrew, everything happened. In January 2020, Iran says we no longer abide by the limitations, but will coordinate with the IAEA. So you see the language which is changed. And now in December 2020, Iran finally said, after Biden came to power, that they're willing to re-enter a deal with US assurances. Now everybody would have seen the photographs of these people at the first, conference with John Kerry and Javed Zarif signing it and all that. So today Iran feels that there are external players which are preventing the negotiations from going forward. And they feel that Israel is one of them, because Israel feels Iran will threaten them with nuclear weapons.
Right.
And Iranian leaders say that Israel will be wiped off the map. Saudi and UAE are also alarmed by Iranian aggression. And I talked about the various groups that they. Now, when Trump, unilaterally tore up the agreement, so to say, he said they had violated the agreement. They said it increased the level of the volume of uranium that was to be enriched. They've improved their research facility. They're not complying with the tenets of the JCPOA. And the location of the strategic value of oil, natural gas. I mean, they are, because of their location, because of the strategic value of their oil and natural gas, they're taking advantage of this and, going against the treaty because they know that they are a major player in the region and they're indulging in what they call the aggressive nuclear diplomacy. So now what has happened is that there's a new team which is in place. Talks are on, and the talks by the Iranian side are now being headed by al-Bagheri. But they are not out as openly as it was being discussed that time by Obama, who used to keep saying that either the deal will take place or there'll be war. I think that's what he was saying. So the issues which are sticking, since you said, are, two, three things. The Iranian position is the sanctions are present, and we have been working within the 2015 framework of the sanctions, and these are all nuclear. Next, they say that there should be some sort of reassurances that how is it that one president signs this, next president tears it up, third president again comes and says, So what is the continuity? What are your processes? Is this a treaty? Is it a pact? Is it approved by Congress? What is the guarantee that you will not go back on it? What happens if a Republican Party comes to power in 2025? Will the deal stand or will it go? Today we are in 2022, 3 years from now. So I mean, this is something. And they are saying we are willing to negotiate some aspects, but some aspects of it are non-negotiable. And one of the aspects they are saying is non-negotiable is the sanction. But clearly there are certain aspects which are not being discussed openly, because the minute they are discussed openly, it will, place impediments in the progress of the talks. Because then you win over the domestic audiences on those the domestic groups on that thing may not be there. Plus, the Iranians are saying that they are foreign players, as I told you, wanted to disrupt it. Now, in the meantime, what has happened? Has Trump actually given, Iran a window in which they were able to flex their muscles great? So what has happened is that I told you the enrichment was 3.67. Today is reached 60%. And if you go to 90%, you'll have a weapon soon. So is it a screwdriver away, or are the Americans wanting to cut down this, force them back to 3.67 and then delay any weapon till 2030s, So I mean, this is something that is there. The Israeli foreign minister says we have the right to act, and it is also our responsibility. And if Iran wants to write us off, we won't allow this to happen. And right now, the focus remains on salvaging the agreement. US says that we are committed that Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons. Benny Gantz has said that US will prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, and but there's recently been a US-Israeli exercise, so the Iranians are worried about that. So Iran feels that will we get the full scope of sanction relief? And, today what you're seeing is a lot of public rhetoric. So will this public rhetoric be the bottom line, or is there room for maneuver with this? And is Iran willing to go under full nuclear commitment? And as Iran says that, how sanctions are labeled doesn't matter. What matters is what are the sanctions. So you can't say I've put nuclear sanctions or terrorist sanctions. Ultimately, am I allowed to sell oil? And the other point is, like, you take a simple thing like somebody wanting to invest. Now, unless there's some foolproof thing intact in place, if you want to invest in infrastructure, if you want to invest in improving the oil facilities, if you want to invest in road, in railways, in port, you need some sort of sureties to put in money into that. Now, for that, India is directly affected. Like we want to develop Charbahar port. We want to develop a North NSTC corridor. We are putting in money into that. If our companies start putting in money into those, and again they come under sanctions, will those companies come under sanctions? At one stage, Iran was under certain sanctions during the terrorist time, that they had capped a limit of how much a company could invest in Iran on any project. Beyond that, that company would be blacklisted. The Americans had done that. So these are all very, live points. They are there. As I told you earlier, leaked information, while the talks are very difficult to handle if it gets out. So they are keeping things under the wrap. Things have to be resolved by the end of the negotiation. But what happens is that when you reach towards the end of a negotiation, honestly, only the difficult things are left to be resolved. All the easy things have been resolved. So what are the difficult things? One of the major difficult things is the issue of IRGC. The West sees IRGC as a terrorist organization. The Iranians do not see IRGC as a terrorist organization. So next thing is, will they go back to 3.67? What will they do with this enriched uranium from 3.67 to 60%? Will they allow full sanctions? Will they agree that nothing will happen? So, as I said, this whole area is an extremely dangerous neighborhood. There's Iraq, there's Pakistan, and there's Afghanistan. These are the countries bordering Iraq. Pakistan is a nuclear country. Afghanistan has problems. Iraq had problems. And now, of course, we've discussed those issues with there. And Iran is involved itself in Syria. It's involved itself in Lebanon. It's involved itself in Iraq. So, we have to see what happens. Public sentiments are pointing towards a deal. Joe Biden wants to undo the damage of Trump. He wants to, but he says, we seek compliance, but the window of opportunity will not be open forever. So who is the pressure on? Is the pressure on the Iranians? Is the pressure on the Americans? This is the statement of the... So, as I said, can you bring it back to 3.7? India has supported JCPOA. And the reasons why is there is that India agrees that Iran should not be a nuclear power. We want better diplomatic relations with Iran. We want the sanctions, if they're lifted, they are in India's interest. And I told you, Charbahar, oil, NSTC, connectivity to Central Asia is extremely important. The Europeans are very pro the deal. The Europeans want the deal. Now, what is coming out in the papers, in Newsweek and all, they're saying that the deal will be in 4 phases, 60-day period, and there'll be a new deal, and that sanctions on 17 banks will be lifted, 150 economic institutions, that sanctions will be lifted. Tehran will be able to start reversing the steps, which is there. This 3.67 I've already told you about. But now, is trust high with these incentives, or is trust low between the both countries? That is there. Next thing is, how do you carry out verification of what all Iran has done, what all it's not done? That is again a huge problem. And Iran wants, as I told you, a sustainable JCPOA. It wants a credible guarantee US will not break the promise again. I mean, this is something and it wants to know what are the surety of the economic benefits which are there. And right now, there in both sides, Iran and US, there are certain degree of people who are anti the deal. So Iranian people who are anti the deal say, see, the Americans let us down, so we were correct. Same way in US, the Republicans are anti the deal. So I mean, and they're right-wing politicians in Israel, who have warned Washington against lifting sanctions. Quds Force I talked about. So this time around, I don't know whether they have illusions. The world has illusions that doing away with the deal will, let Iran moderate its behavior or not. And regional tensions will rise in case Iran continues with the deal. And but if the deal goes through, as I said, apart from the 80 million Iranians who will have a better life because sanctions will be lifted, it will also be affecting the rest of the world. And it will be a great step forward as far as I see it, as far as India goes. But these are the main issues that is there. And I think ultimately the major issue will be two. And the first issue will be that whether what is the guarantee the Americans can give that this deal will stick in case the Biden administration changes, in case the
Changes after that.
Republicans
That's, I
come
think,
to
one of the
power.
biggest things. Yes.
Yeah, and the next big thing is that what do they do with the, how do they roll back to 3.67? I mean, that's where the world is worried about. I think these are the two major sticking points. I think this economic sanction and, IRGC and all that can all be resolved. But these two, I mean, Iran will look for some guarantee. Yeah, it was really wonderful talking to you and interacting with you. And what comes out at the end of this interaction are all three positive things. So the three things we've talked about, all three seem to be heading in the right direction as far as the region is concerned presently. But as I said, the patterns keep changing over the years. So whether this pattern remains or not, we can't guarantee. So the first positive thing is the Iran-Iraq relations are, historically since modernization of modern Iran and modern Iraq, they are at the best at this particular time. Whether Iraq will get what it wants in the region, this maximalist position, as I call it, which is a entirely solidified Shia bloc, which is totally pro-Iran, in control, and they control that, and and harp on religious sentiments, or whether they need to diversify and start looking at the non hardline and the more of the secularist Shias and start focusing on the development, governance, and job assistance for the youth. That is more important. As far as Saudi and Iranian ties are concerned, here they've been ups and downs throughout. And the bottom line is the sectarian reason. That is the major issue. The major issue is the conflict between the Shias and the Sunnis. And the major issue is who represents the Islam, who represents the face of the, who's more powerful in controlling this religion discourse in the region, whether it is Saudi Arabia or whether it is Iran, who's both. And as you all know, that the major sites of this, as far as the holy sites are concerned, lie in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia considers itself the custodian of these holy sites. Both countries are extremely prosperous as far as oil wealth is concerned. Of course, the Saudis' per capita income is much higher. Both were on the same side when they were both monarchies supported by the West, the Shah and the King of Saudi Arabia. Today, there's total differences in their way of governance. The interesting thing is that it's almost like a clash between, is it a clash between the Arab world and the Persian speaking world? I mean, that's another thing that civilization. The Persians have always retained their identity, irrespective of what has happened over the. So this is something that also we have to think about, but things are looking good. And surprisingly, the person who's working to improve the relations is Iraq. So Iraq is the main country, which is now, almost, and that also in the Middle East, in this region, or the West Asia, as we call it, Middle East as it's referred to by most people, is that personal things also matter a lot. Personal stature, personal standing, personal behavior. So they deal with the country, but they also deal with the individual. So the Al-Khademi had a great, respect everywhere, in Iran, in Saudi, in Iraq. And I mean, it was because of his good offices this was working out. So whether this continues or not, but as I said today, the signs are extremely good that it's looking up. And the third issue we discovered is discussed in JCPOA. It's actually Iran leveraging their nuclear issues to remove sanctions. And there is no denying it that if the JCPO is in place, it's a win-win situation for everybody in the region. And the especially as far as India is concerned, because now it will enable countries to invest in Iran, invest in the infrastructure. It will help us develop our port. It will help us with our north-south corridor, and also it will allow Iran to export more oil, and overall the crude prices will drop, and this will offset what is happening in, the crude prices have risen tremendously because of the Ukrainian conflict. So this is
Absolutely.
a win-win situation for everybody. So I think there's a step in the right direction, and things are looking up. But as I said, at the end, only the difficult point remains, and the difficult points I feel, as I summed them up earlier, are what has Iran gone far beyond the level of enrichment that they had to go? Will they be able to roll back? What is the sanctions against the IRGC? And as far as Iran is concerned, their concern is how will the West be able to guarantee that this deal is not broken? That's what I feel. But wonderful talking to you, Adi. Thank you once again for calling me on your show.
Absolutely, sir. It's a pleasure. I think, it's the in-depth knowledge of history and the facts which actually lead to a wonderful discussion. So all kudos to you. Let me put that out very clearly. Uh, One thing that I note from what you've mentioned, and it is interesting to actually learn this particular factor today, is that uh, the geopolitics between the region as per se is basically teetering on a thin thread. Now it is a perception whether the thread is thick enough for all the people to walk through, because till now it has not been so. As you said, the questions with regards to JCPOA surround a lot of people. Of course, Israelis are, all guns blazing with regards to this. How does the US hold them back? uh, the trust factor is, as you mentioned in your this thing, which is I think indescribable. It's not something that can be put into words, because do the Saudis actually trust the Iranians? And because I actually did an interview with someone from Israel who shared a point of view that the Saudis would not normalize with Israel till the time the Iranian question is resolved, because they can use Iran as a leverage against Israel, is against or for, as per this thing. So there's a lot, happening in that particular region, which you've shared some light into, and that's really interesting. I'd like to thank you, sir. I think a lot of research would have gone to your side through your personal experience, and of course, a lot of the prep that I can see, which is there in front of you. Thank you so much for doing that. Of course, this is a subject that I'd like to dwell a little further, considering what's happening with Israel, which moves up, and of course these whole, as they're known non-state actors that roam around in that particular region, which pretty much nobody claims, but everybody points the fingers at the other person, which may also become one of the biggest stumbling blocks to peace in the Middle East / West Asia. Till next time, sir, for another interesting subject in the Middle East, West Asia, as I just said. Jai Hind.
Thank you, and Jai Hind.